Hello, my name is Jake Kramer and welcome to my Sprint 6 YouTube update video. First, I'm going to talk about our team's division of work. Next, I'm going to demonstrate our new features of our application, or specifically my new features that I added. Then I'm going to go on to GitHub and discuss some of the new code that I added to our repository. And then finally, I'm going to go on to Team Gantt and talk about some of the tasks that I did in Sprint 6 and the tasks that I will do in the next one. So, first of all, for the division of work, I mainly worked on implementing adding a new pod to an account whenever we want to create new meal pods. Alexis worked on the meal plan info screen, Isaiah the edit profile screen, Max the profile screen, and Brandon worked on the meal history and meal rating screens. If I go ahead and demonstrate our application, you can notice that if I click into a meal pod here, we go into a screen for managing our pod, but this is for editing an existing pod. If I go ahead and I tap this icon in the top right corner, it will take me to a pod management screen where I will get to manage a new pod, and I have an option to save it. Another new feature, a new feature real quick, is if I go to manage members, if there are no members to a meal pod, then it will inform me that I haven't added any members yet, just so that it's more intuitive for the user to know. And then without editing the pod info or without adding any new members, if I go ahead and save this pod, it will navigate me back to the calendar. I haven't coded it for the calendar to update yet when this happens, but if I go ahead and reload it, you can see that my new meal pod is right up here at the top, and I can click into it just like any normal meal pod. I'm going to go into GitHub and talk about how I programmed this. So this sprint consisted of two main commits, one for adding meal pod prerequisite tweaks and the other for finishing up the adding the new meal pod functionality. So first off, the prerequisite tweaks, I knew that at some point I would have to work with the adding new member screen, which is navigated from the member management screen. So I wanted to make it easier for me to deal with these screens by adding the styling and adding any functionalities I think we will need for the end product, since we are approaching that stage of development. And that's all that is. But most of my changes are on the pod management screen for a new pod, where most of my code is borrowed from the pod management edit pod screen, which is why it's very identical, with a couple of tweaks, such as I now have a meal pod template that I'll use to eventually add that template, update that template, and add it to Firestore. I uncommented the save button down here, somewhere down here, right here. And then I created the handle save function, which was right up here, where I gave myself, a to do, where I would, once I click the save button, it will upload that mealpod template to Firestore. And then the next commit finishes all of this up. So another thing I did was I updated the mealpod template. I created an admin template because for every mealpod that's created, the user who creates it becomes the admin of that mealpod. So if I go down again to where that to do used to be, handle save, yeah. So right here, I no longer needed this to do. And I go ahead, and when I press the save button, I add the meal pod to Firestore, which contains three basic functions. First, I have to add that meal pod template to Firestore. And that's what this function does here. Next, I have to add that I have to add an admin to Firestore, who will be linked to this meal pod by its ID, and linked to the user by the user ID. And then the third, basically the third step in finally adding a meal pod is I have to add that admin ID to the pod's list of admin IDs. And it all has to be done in a certain order because Firebase creates these IDs, so I have to create a meal pod before I can create an admin, before I can add that admin to the new meal pod. But it all works, so I'm really happy with that. A couple of problems, like a couple of challenges I had was I didn't know that I was writing to one of our legitimate collections. I thought I was using like a test collection where I wouldn't be touching some of our correct data and usable data. And so for a little bit, my calendar screen actually stopped loading or stopped working because some of that data was just test data and invalid for my calendar screen to read. So yeah, that's what caused me to split this task into 2 commits. So yeah, if I go into my team Gantt, so for sprint cycle 6. I repurposed a couple of screens, such as the member management screen and the member management, or meal pod management, and then the member management. And hopefully, I will get to repurpose the adding new member screen as well. The back end, so actually adding those objects to Firestore, I accomplished that. Research and understanding took me a while to see how I could reuse some of these screens, and then the component styling as well. And that's about what I accomplished in the last sprint. That comes out to 13 hours. If I go down to my sprint cycle 7, this time I plan to hopefully finish adding a new meal pod where I'll be able to add members to this new meal pod object, and hopefully edit the new meal pod's info as well. That hasn't quite been implemented yet, so I can just add a blank meal pod. And that can work in tandem with the adding new member screen. If I can implement this screen to work both for adding a new meal pod and editing a meal pod, that would be actually great. So and same with the edit meal pods, or the edit meal pod info screen. Yeah, so that sums up everything that I did in the last sprint. So I talked about our division of work. I went and demonstrated our application. I went to GitHub to talk about some of my code and check-ins, and then I went to Team Gantt to talk about my tasks. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in class.